The Horus Heresy was one of the most brutal conflicts in Warhammer 40k history, as brother turned against brother and the galaxy burned. But let's be honest folks, it was also the ultimate group project. Because half of the Space Marine legions showed up ready to carry, they put in the work, conquered star systems, broke enemy lines, and left their mark on the Horus Heresy. But the other half, they spent the war getting folded like a pancake, or just straight up disappearing to do drugs. Yes, I'm looking at you, Emperor's children. So today, I'm grading every single Space Marine Legion based on their performance during the Horus Heresy. I'll be looking at key battles, clutch moments, and of course, some absolutely catastrophic failures. At the end of each Legion's breakdown, I'll be handing out a grade from S for Space Marine Superstar, all the way down to F for Fraud. Who carried, who choked, and which Legion deserves to be harassed as a fraud? Well, let's find out by jumping into the cow hole. Class is in session, my little cows. It's time to hand out the grades. Let's first go over the grading system I will be using in today's video. Since I'm grading each Legion based on their overall performance during the Horus Heresy, which includes pretty much everything, from land, space, and siege battles, to their overall impact on the war, but most importantly, I won't be including Primarch decisions, since that could change the grading of entire legions just because their dad was on a sick one at that current moment. So this isn't just about individual moments, it's about how the Legion performed as a complete fighting force throughout the Heresy. Now if you guys insist, I could absolutely do a separate video grading how each Primarch did during the Heresy. So if that's something you want to see, make sure to show some love on this video. Now with that out of the way, let's establish the grading system. To keep things simple, we're working with a classic scale. S, A, B, C, D, and F, which means fraud. S grade is the absolute peak. These are the legions that put the Heresy on their backs. They dominated battles, made several amazing decisions, and consistently showed up when it mattered. Those who receive the A grade are still elite and had a major impact on the Heresy, but maybe lack the extra dominance or consistency to be considered true S tier material. B-grade legions are solid, they did their jobs, had their moments, contributed to the war effort, and weren't liabilities. But they weren't exactly stealing the spotlight either. C-grade legions are mid. They have inconsistent performances, or are just not doing enough relative to their potential. They are not terrible, but definitely not impressive. The legions that receive a D grade struggle either due to poor leadership, bad strategy, or simply not having an impact on the Heresy at all. They were more of a liability than an asset for large portions of the war. Then finally, we come to F for fraud. Yeah, these legions did next to nothing, fumbled critical moments, or straight up made things worse. We're talking wasted potential, embarrassing showings, or disappearing acts when the galaxy was literally on fire. Remember folks, this is my opinion, and if you disagree, let me hear down in the comments. I'm sure I'm going to upset a few of you, but I am a talking cow, so my opinion has to be correct. At the end of this video, I will be crowning an MVP for each side, both loyalist and traitor, on who I think truly stands above the rest of these roided up transhumans. But without further ado, let's start the grading with the first Legion, the Dark Angels. The first Legion, the Dark Angels, are defined by their 6 specialized wings: the Stormwing, Deathwing, Ravenwing, Dreadwing, Ironwing, and Firewing, all of which allow them to master any combat style, making them a jack-of-all-trades Legion, which definitely helped them throughout the Heresy. And since I'm going to be doing this for every single Legion, let's talk about their pre-Heresy numbers and their fleet size. Because the size of each Legion, whether they were big or small, impacts how much they could have done during the Heresy. Pre-Heresy, we know the Dark Angels were sitting at slightly under 200,000 Space Marines. making them one of the largest legions, and probably they would have been if it weren't for the Rangdang massacres. On top of that, they fielded a strong naval presence, including 3 Gloriana-class battleships, the Invincible Reason, Paradigm of Hate, and Truth's Razor. And then there's their war gear. The Dark Angels had access to a vast array of Dark Age of technology weapons, AI-driven Excendio-class battle automata, Neuro Gauntlets, Displacer Fields, Molecular Disintegrators, Stasis and Temporal Bombs, and Cyclonic Torpedoes, which is all absurdly powerful stuff.
Behold my stuff.
For example, the Excendio were able to stalemate Conrad Kurz during a battle, while Cyclonic Torpedoes can straight up destroy entire planets. To add to this already ridiculous arsenal, they also possessed the Tuchula device, discovered by Lionel Johnson and stolen from the Death Guard as seen in the novella The Lion. This sentient device allowed for extremely precise and efficient warp travel, giving the Legion a major strategic advantage. So overall, the Dark Angels entered the Heresy with one of the largest legions, an immensely powerful navy, and some of the most advanced and dangerous weaponry in the Imperium. Now let's go over a brief summary of what the Dark Angels actually did during the Heresy with all of these advantages. At the outbreak of the war, the First Legion was widely dispersed due to the scheming of Horus, with their forces spread across the Imperium's southern and western borders. Even with this disadvantage, the Lion was able to lead a strike force to the Forge world of Dymat, successfully denying the traitors a key supply base. Now yes, the Lion did hand over the siege weapons to Perturabo, but that's more on the Lion than the First Legion, so we're not holding that against them here. From there, the Dark Angels played a major role in the Thramas Crusade. For context, the Night Lords had nearly achieved total victory by 007 M31, having ravaged the Thramas system. But when the Dark Angels arrived in 008 M31, the tide shifted hard. Using superior tactics, a powerful fleet, and their Dark Age of technology weaponry, they began systematically retaking planets and driving back both the Night Lords and the corrupted Mechanicum. Even when the Night Lords counterattacked and started pushing the Dark Angels back, by using the Tuchula, the First Legion managed to ambush around 200 Night Lord capital ships, along with 600 supporting vessels, catching them completely off guard. The result was most of the traitors were annihilated, many destroyed while still anchored. Some Night Lords managed to flee, but their legion was utterly shattered, with over 60,000 of their Space Marines killed, the majority of their fleet destroyed or captured.
That's a lot of damage.
With fewer than 10,000 Dark Angels lost in the attempt. That is a massive victory for the Loyalists. By the time of the Siege of Terra, the Lion attempted to draw traitor forces away by attacking their homeworlds. He destroyed Chemos, Nuceria, and Barbarus, which affected the traitors in the warp. Meanwhile, a fraction of his legion, 10,000 warriors under Corswain, managed to reach Terra, playing a pivotal role in restoring the Astronomicon, which would allow Guilliman to find Terra at the end of the siege. It's also worth noting that Horus himself seemed to actively avoid facing the Lion throughout the war. Now it seemed that the one man that Horus did not want to face had returned. The Lion had entered the war, and worse yet, the stoic Lord of Caliban had been driven to anger by the actions of his brothers. But of course, the Dark Angels didn't do everything correctly. There are a couple mistakes that lower their grade. What occurs during Imperium Secundus is a big one. The Lion failed to disclose that Conrad Kurz was aboard his flagship, which ultimately led Kurz to making it down to Macragge, the homeworld of the Ultramarines, and causing an insane amount of chaos. On top of that, the Dark Angels also bombed Macragge against Guilliman's wishes. But these are more of Primarch decisions, so I'm not going to exclusively hold that against the First Legion, but still it's something that impacted their overall effectiveness. Then there's their post-Imperium Secundus strategy, which focused heavily on destroying traitor homeworlds. I did mark this as a pro, but it's also a negative. While this did affect the traitors, it also meant that only a relatively small force of Dark Angels actually made it to the Siege of Terra. And that's the real criticism here. For a legion of their size, strength, and technological advantage, the Dark Angels weren't truly at the main front of the war when it mattered the most. They carried in certain theaters, especially against the Night Lords, but you could argue they should have done even more, particularly in committing more forces to the Siege of Terra. You could even argue that Luther and the Fallen are another mark against the first. By the end of the Heresy, the Fallen turned traitor, bombed the Lion and the Dark Angels from orbit, and fractured the Legion at a critical moment. That said though, the Fallen didn't really help the traitor war effort during the Heresy, and in some cases, elements of them even made their way to Terra to help Corswain. Now, whether that was out of loyalty or part of a deeper attempt to sway him and his forces to Luther's agenda is definitely up for debate. But the point is, their role isn't entirely black and white. The Fallen were more about fighting for the independence of Caliban rather than Horus's domination of the galaxy. So while the Fallen and Luther absolutely became a major internal failure for the First Legion, especially towards the end, it's not something that massively impacts their overall performance during the Horus Heresy. So overall, while they weren't perfect and had some questionable strategic decisions, I'm going to give the Dark Angels a A grade. I simply wish they had a bigger impact towards the climax of the Heresy. I mean, imagine if Guilliman had those torpedoes. He could have just nuked the Iron Warriors and moved on. Some food for your thought right there. But the Dark Angels earn a well-deserved A grade. Next up are the ketamine abusers of the Emperor's Children. The Emperor's Children are our first traitor legion on this list, and unlike the Dark Angels, they were not one of the largest legions by the time of the Heresy. Their numbers are a bit conflicting, but it seems they were sitting around 50,000 legionaries at the start of the Heresy, largely as a result of the devastating losses sustained during the Istvan atrocities. Before that, during the later days of the Great Crusade, their strength was much higher. Sources pin them as closer to 110,000. And while we don't know their exact fleet size, it's safe to say it wasn't anything exceptional. They did have one Gloriana-class battleship, the Pride of the Emperor, but I will be honest, it did not see much action throughout the Heresy. Before we jump into the many fuck-ups the 3rd Legion has throughout the Heresy, let's quickly talk about where they started. Because the Emperor's Children were one of the most efficient and disciplined legions in the Imperium during the Great Crusade. They strove for perfection in all things, constantly refining their military doctrine. Every single Space Marine trained almost constantly for their assigned role, whether that was a frontline soldier, pilot, gunner, scout, or sniper. They were precise, coordinated, and incredibly effective. But once the Heresy began, the standard of perfection completely collapsed. As they fell deeper into chaos and the influence of Slaanesh, the Legion became increasingly hedonistic and obsessed with sensation rather than victory. Their priorities shifted away from the goals of the Heresy and towards their own indulgence. And this rot only got worse as the war dragged on. At Istvan 3 and 5, they were technically victorious, but like I said, the cost was insane. As the 3rd Legion lost nearly half of their numbers at the very start of the Horus Heresy, which is absolutely catastrophic for any legion.
That's rough, buddy.
After Istvan 5, things only continued to spiral. The perfect fortress, constructed by Fulgrim in a strategically vital system, was taken by the Raven Guard after they lured the Emperor's Children out of position, resulting in the complete destruction of the entire garrison. They suffered losses at Chemos when their homeworld was destroyed. They failed to capture Baal, the homeworld of the Blood Angels, and were actively losing in the Loren Alphen campaign against the White Scars until the arrival of the Sons of Horus and the Dark Mechanicum turned the tide in their favor. So as you can see right off the bat, the Emperor's Children sure did do a lot of losing during the early portion of the Horus Heresy. Later, during the events of Angels Exterminatus, the Legion accompanied Fulgrim and Perturabo to the Crone world of Lydris, where Fulgrim and the Emperor's Children betrayed the Iron Warriors, so Fulgrim could ascend to demonhood, using Perturabo as a sacrifice to reach Apotheosis. At this point, whatever cohesion the Legion had completely collapsed, as the Emperor's Children dissolved into scattered warbands, with many following Fulgrim into the warp, while others conducted their own sadistic raids across Imperial space. Thankfully, the Emperor's Children weren't completely useless, because if it wasn't for this one Space Marine, the Emperor's Children might be facing a fraud grade. This Space Marine is Eidolon. I know, right? How the fuck is Eidolon saving the Emperor's children? Well, if you guys don't know, Eidolon retained control over roughly a third of the Legion. And if my cow calculations are correct, that would be around 17,000 Space Marines. And with this force, he actually attempted to prosecute the war properly. His campaigns against the White Scars at the Khole Gate and the Catalyst Rift stand out as rare examples of competence among the Third. At the Khole Gate, the Emperor's children successfully ambushed the White Scars, contributing to the chain of events that led to the death of Quinn Jha at Eidolon's hands. During the battle at the Catalyst Rift, Eidolon and Mortarion led a combined fleet of Death Guard and Emperor's children against the White Scars, trying to prevent them from returning to Terra. This resulted in a massive and brutal space battle, but ultimately the traitors failed to stop the White Scars. Not another great look, Emperor's children.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
And you're probably asking yourself, where the hell is Fulgrim? Well, he was in the warp the entire time, doing heinous things with Nakari. And it took Lorgar knowing the true name of the Demon Primarch to return him to the war. With Fulgrim's return, the Legion completely mustered on Ulanor, helped secure Beta-Garmon for the traitors, which are two small positives, but even then, the same problems resurfaced. They fell back into excess, delusion, and drug-fueled insanity, which once again led to them not having a real impact on the latter days of the Heresy. By the time of the Saturn IX assault during the Siege of Terra, the Emperor's children had all but dissolved yet again. Like, I'm not kidding, guys, the other traitors used them as punching bags, throwing them at the Imperial walls in a desperate attempt to get any remaining use out of them before they became completely uncontrollable. During the events of Saturn IX, Fulgrim literally breaks the Saturn IX wall himself and still fumbles to do anything with that due to his own excess, which I will say is something very worthy of slander. Like, as much as I love Chadol Dorn, how the hell do you lose to this guy? He is literally a yellow road and you can't beat him in one-on-one combat? Come on, Fulgrim! What are we doing here? Chadol Dorn even says this himself when discussing the Emperor's children and Fulgrim. You know the real irony? Fulgrim could have taken the wall. The power he has, the Legion's strength, the unimaginable demon gifts. He cut the wall wide open, brother, wide open. But for a stroke of fortune, I held it closed. Fulgrim got deeper and faster than any of them so far. Excess was his undoing, as ever. The brazen confidence of overstrength, he threw his whole legion into a space too small. I tell you this plainly, brother, if the War Master or the Lord of Iron had ever managed to harness him, he would have won this for them in a matter of days. He could have been their greatest weapon. So that right there sums up the Emperor's children perfectly. Insane potential, completely wasted. Yes, they did contribute in certain areas. Fulgrim helped design the defensive plan for Istvan V, and the Legion did defend and fight across multiple war zones. But the reality is, they lost a massive number of engagements, turned on allies, like during the conflict with Perturabo and the Iron Warriors during Angels Exterminatus, and by the end of the war, they simply didn't care anymore. The only real reason they aren't completely frauds is because of Eidolon, who somehow is one of the few members of this Legion actually trying to win the war. So considering their losses, their lack of cohesion, their constant failures, and the fact that they basically collapsed into a hedonistic mess before the war was even over, I'm going to give the Emperor's children a D grade. And honestly, they're not far off from fraud. They are the literal potential Legion, just like their daddy, if he decided to ease off the ketamine and lock in for once. Next up, we have the crybabies of the Iron Warriors. And if there's one Legion that truly understood the assignment during the Horus Heresy, it was these guys. The Iron Warriors, led by Perturabo, specialized in siege warfare, attrition, and grinding their enemies into dust. During the Heresy, they were one of the largest legions, numbering roughly between 150 to 180,000. with some estimates placing them even higher, over 200,000. Prior to the heavy casualties sustained by the 4th Legion during the latter days of the Great Crusade, specifically during the Harut campaign. We know that they had over 100 capital ships at the minimum, along with an unspecified number of sub-capital vessels, and due to their constant recruitment and shipbuilding efforts prior to the heresy, their overall naval strength was significant. So the question is, with all that power, what did the Iron Warriors accomplish during the heresy? Well, to put it quite simply, they did literally everything. No, seriously, while other legions were out here discovering new drugs, writing poetry, or just straight up disappearing, the Iron Warriors were doing the actual work of winning the war. I know I like to shit on Purdy and the Iron Warriors a ton, but they really put the teams on their back here. They fought at Istvan, won key victories at Hydra Cordis, Vanheim, Artaic Skyfort, and Better Garmon. They were the backbone of the traitor war effort, keeping the logistics alive while everyone else was busy losing their minds. At the end of the heresy, they were assigned to guard the rear planets that stood in Guilliman's way after the Ruin Storm was cleared. These were not glorious campaigns either. The Iron Warriors were often overextended, undersupplied, and locked in brutal, thankless sieges against these Ultramarine forces. It was basically the Great Crusade all over again, but worse, and they still held the line. Eventually, Peter Turbo was ordered to abandon many of these hard-fought worlds and regroup, tasked with finding Angron and mustering at Ulanor for the final push on Terra. Even after years of brutal fighting and losses, he obeyed, successfully bringing Angron and the World Eaters back into the fold for the siege. And during the Siege of Terra, the Iron Warriors, and most importantly Perturabo, really showed who was boss. As this was their moment, the ultimate siege, the final test against Rogel Dorn. Throughout the siege, they led assaults on key objectives like the Lionsgate spaceport and the Gorgon Bar, driving the traitor advance forward. Meanwhile, at this point though, every other traitor legion was either corrupted beyond recognition or just doing their own thing. As the siege dragged on, Perturabo eventually crashed out when Horus ordered him to break apart his legion and hand over command to Mortarion and the Death Guard. Like, wouldn't you also crash out too? This resulted in Perturabo withdrawing most of the Iron Warriors from the siege, but by that point, to be honest, the siege was essentially done, and the traitors' victory was mere meters away. Now that we've talked about the positives, we have to talk about the setbacks the Iron Warriors experienced throughout the heresy. The Battle of Fall is a big one. Despite having a numerical advantage, the Iron Warriors nearly lost their entire fleet to Alexius Pollux and a smaller Imperial Fist fleet, largely due to the Loyalists being better equipped and more maneuverable. The only reason the Iron Warriors weren't completely wiped out is because Pollux received orders from Dorn to return to Terra and actually followed them, retreating before he could finish the job. Then there's also the battle at Talarn, what was supposed to be a quick hidden seize operation to secure the Black Oculus, which would have healed Perturabo's damaged state due to the events of Angel's Exterminatus, turned into the largest armored conflict in Imperial history. Over 1 million tanks clashed across the planet, and despite all that effort, the Iron Warriors were ultimately forced to retreat by the order of Horus. Their losses were so severe that Perturabo had to initiate a mass recruitment just to recover. And finally, you could make the argument that withdrawing from Terra is also a deduction to their overall score. But honestly, like I said, at that point, the siege was already spiraling into madness, time itself was breaking down, and the war had shifted far beyond anything Perturabo had signed up for. Despite these small setbacks, I think you could easily see that without the Iron Warriors, the heresy straight up does not function. While legions, like the Emperor's Children, are out here fumbling every objective imaginable, the Iron Warriors are driving the assault on Terra, securing major planets, holding the line against Guilliman's advancing forces, maintaining supply lines, and doing the actual grinding work required to win a galactic civil war. They were consistent, they were effective, and they carried harder than almost anyone. This is easily a S-grade legion, and they may actually be one of the strongest contenders for MVP of the entire Horus Heresy. Blink and you miss them, chase them, and you're already dead. Next up are the White Scars. a legion that specializes in hit-and-run tactics, guerrilla warfare, and speed. In terms of numbers, the White Scars sat around 95,000 legionaries, with a fairly substantial fleet to back them up at the beginning of the Horus Heresy. At Kondax alone, they fielded roughly 700 ships, likely representing the majority of the 5th Legion's naval strength. And these vessels were heavily modified for speed, making them faster than almost anything else the Imperium, including trader fleets, had at their disposal. Now, before we even get to their performance, the White Scars are in a really interesting position at the start of the Heresy, because up to half of their legion were initially leaning towards siding with Horus, influenced by warrior lodges and long-standing cultural tensions between Terran-born Marines and those from Jagoras. Many Terran-born warriors favored Horus, while those loyal to Jagatai Khan remained committed to the Emperor. This internal divide nearly shattered the Legion before it even entered the war. Leaders like Torgan Khan and Hazak Noan Khan attempted to seize control of the fleet at Prospero and bring the White Scars to the traitor's side. So right off the bat, we do have a slight negative that their own legion tried to turn traitor, but thanks to the actions of Shaban Khan, who led a boarding assault against the Sword Storm and held the line until Jagatai Khan returned from Prospero. After which, the rebellion was crushed. I will say that although the Legion was split, the Khan was able to retain most of his warriors, as the surviving traitors within the Legion were condemned to the Sagiar Monsan, suicide units tasked with earning redemption through death in battle. For the next 4 years, the White Scars were effectively cut off from Terra. Warp storms blocked long-range travel, while the traitor fleets controlled the main routes back to the throne world. With no clear path forward, Jagatai and the White Scars adopted a strategy of hit-and-run warfare, launching a prolonged guerrilla campaign against traitor supply lines and reinforcements. Now, during this period, the White Scars didn't have a massive, obvious impact on the war in the same way the other legions did, but that doesn't mean they weren't ineffective. Far from it. Their constant raids forced the traitors to divert resources, disrupted supply chains, and slowed Horus's advance on Terra. In particular, the Sagiar Monsan proved extremely effective, with warriors like Hebo Khan leading assaults against the Sons of Horus and even badly wounding one of the Marnaval, Horus Aximon, during the Battle of Dwell. Torgan Khan also stood out, surviving multiple suicidal engagements against traitor fleets during this period. Still, the cost was heavy. Around 1/5 of the Legion was lost during these years of isolation and constant fighting. Eventually, after defeats at the Battle of the Kaleum Gate and the costly retreat using the Dark Glass at the Battle of Catalyst, the White Scars made their escape towards Terra, which is where the 5th Legion truly shines. During the siege, they launched constant hit-and-run assaults, as seen in The Lost and the Damned, harassing traitor forces and disrupting their operations. Their Stormseers played a critical role in banishing the greater demons summoned by the Thousand Suns to breach the Imperial Palace. They also saved millions of civilian lives, something that is kind of an afterthought when considering the Siege of Terra. But by far and away, their biggest contribution came when retaking the Lionsgate spaceport. In a decisive and incredibly high-risk operation, the White Scars reclaimed the port, banished the demon Primarch Mortarion, and sent the entire Death Guard Legion into full retreat. Although Jagatai was nearly killed in the process, commanders like Shaban Khan, Jangsai Khan, and Gazorg Noan Khan held the line and fortified the position. Holding the Lionsgate spaceport opened the door for reinforcements, allowing forces like the Ultramarines, Dark Angels, and Space Wolves to reach Terra more easily. Now, I will say one of the main criticisms of the 5th Legion is their relatively limited presence in the early stages of the Heresy. They weren't at Istvan, and they weren't driving the early war. But honestly, that's not really their fault. They were stuck at the Kondak system, fighting the Orcs in the middle of nowhere, cut off from the wider Imperium due to warp storms. But even then, like I stated earlier, their guerrilla campaign against the traitors definitely makes up for it. As stated in Path of Heaven, Dispersed, Strategos recorded 19 strikes in 3 months, 13 of which were repulsed. The tally of losses will be hurting them. He musters, surely now, for a final assault. That would be against 4 legions, and he has not the numbers to take more than 1. If I were the Khan, I would be looking for a way out. This tells us everything we need to know. The Khan's campaign forced the traitors to divert major resources, including elements from 4 legions, just to deal with him. That kind of pressure slowed Horus's advance and bought valuable time for the Loyalist forces. Without that, the road to Terra becomes a lot easier for the traitors, and the Loyalists may not have the time to consolidate their defenses or bring in reinforcements like the Blood Angels. So while they didn't dominate the early heresy, the White Scars were there when it mattered. They disrupted the enemy, survived against overwhelming odds, and then played a pivotal role in the Siege of Terra. For all of these reasons, I'm giving the White Scars an A grade. They were definitely important, but not quite on the level of a legion like the Iron Warriors, who carried a massive portion of the war effort from start to finish. Does anyone hear that howling? Oh no. The space furries are up next. Yep, we have the Space Wolves, and I have a feeling that no matter what I say, people are going to be upset. So I'm going to make sure I am being as thorough as possible. First, I'll address the obvious. I have spoken ill of Leman Russ and his legion in the past, and I will, once again, without shame, assert the claim that he is in fact a loser. But in this video, I'm going to put that aside and give an unbiased take and grade for the 6th Legion. Surprisingly, the Space Wolves are a medium-sized legion sitting around 95,000 Marines, with a relatively smaller fleet consisting of about 60 capital ships and 240 sub-capital ships, which is roughly 300 vessels in total. Once again, this is pretty surprising, as I thought the Space Wolves, who are supposed to be the Emperor's executioners, would have way more fellas. As everyone knows, the Space Wolves were not present at the Dropsite Massacre, nor were they present at the Siege of Terra, largely due to their own decisions, which we'll get to in a second. Before even the events of the Dropsite Massacre, the Space Wolves were ordered to retrieve Magnus the Red and bring him back to Terra following his violation of the Council of Nicaea. However, after the now corrupted Horus interfered and manipulated the orders, Russ's mission was changed from retrieval to outright annihilation, which leads us directly to the burning of Prospero, which, to put it simply, is my 9/11. The Space Wolves attacked Prospero in an attempt to carry out the Emperor's will, resulting in Magnus and his legion being roughly 90% destroyed and forced to retreat to the Eye of Terror, and more specifically, the Planet of Sorcerers. Magnus himself was shattered into multiple pieces by Leman Russ, who banged his ass. However, the cost for the Space Wolves was massive. Even with the support of the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, they lost around 25,000, with an additional 10,000 under Jorn Bloodhowl going missing after pursuing the fleeing Thousand Sons into the warp. If we take their original number of 95,000 as accurate, that means they lost around 35,000 Marines, which is roughly 36.8% of their legion, in one battle. So Prospero definitely wasn't the Space Wolves' best day. But folks, it gets worse. Because the problem is, even though Russ and the Space Wolves were following orders, they effectively destroyed a legion that could have remained loyal, while also crippling their own forces in the process. You could argue Magnus was already doomed due to his dealings with Tzeentch, but still, turning a legion traitor while losing over a third of your own is not exactly a great look. And I will say, it doesn't get much better from there for the 6th Legion. After Prospero, the Space Wolves were ambushed by the Alpha Legion while still recovering from their losses. They were forced to retreat into the Alexius Nebula, where they were pursued and ultimately surrounded, finding themselves completely trapped. An excerpt from the book Scars really shows how bad this situation got. For a long time, despite more voxed reports of damage and destruction, Russ said nothing. Every time a vessel destroyed notice flickered up on the view screens, he winced. The gesture was unfiend. This Primarch cared about his legion as much as any other, perhaps more so. Bjorn thought that Russ looked strangely old then. as though the years had suddenly piled deadening weight upon his brawler's shoulders. "That's enough," Russ growled at last. "We'll get torn to pieces if we stay in this." So as you can see from the book Scars, the 6th Legion's fleet was getting absolutely shredded, and it was only saved by the intervention of the Dark Angels, who arrived in a massive star fort to save the 6th. We don't have their exact Legion numbers after the Alexius Nebula campaign concluded, but it's safe to say that both their fleet and manpower were severely depleted. But now we get to their most controversial part by far. After regrouping, the Space Wolves assembled what remained of their Legion, which is about 40,000 Space Marines, and launched an assassination strike against Horus at the Battle of Trisolian. This was essentially a suicide attack, as the Space Wolves would be going against not only the Sons of Horus, but also Wordbearers, Alpha Legion, World Eaters, Night Lords, and Iron Warriors. So they were vastly outnumbered. But even more insane, they almost succeeded. Russ did manage to wound Horus with the Dionysian Spear, which is a major achievement. But he failed to finish the job, was badly wounded himself, going into a goddamn coma, and in the process, the Space Wolves were absolutely devastated. Around 4/5 of the Legion, roughly 32,000 Marines, were killed or wounded, leaving only around 8,000 of the remaining 40,000 left. And because of this, the Space Wolves obviously did not make the Siege of Terra, and to be as frank as possible, were not a threat for the remainder of the Heresy. And to make things even worse, they were nearly wiped out again at the Battle of Urant, only surviving thanks to Corvus Corax and the Raven Guard arriving at the last moment. Now the Battle of Trisolian wasn't all negatives. Leman Russ wounding Horus did have consequences. It nearly killed him, and in his weakened state contributed to Lorgar attempting a coup, which ultimately failed and kept the majority of the Wordbearers Legion from fully participating in the Siege of Terra. But you could also argue the opposite. Horus being wounded by the Dionysian Spear led to his soul being recombined through Malakirst, resulting in a stronger, more complete version of Horus, one who would ultimately go on to mortally wound the Emperor in the end and the death. So depending on how you look at it, that decision either helped the Loyalists or made things a lot worse. You can genuinely argue both sides. As for other contributions, the Space Wolves did deploy watch packs to monitor other legions and Primarchs, but I will admit most were completely wiped out. Specifically, the team sent to the Night Lords and the Alpha Legion were massacred, and the group sent to the Blood Angels were slaughtered by the Red Thirst infected Blood Angels at Cygnus Prime. One notable bright spot is the watchpack sent to Rebute Gilliman. This watchpack actually fought Conrad Kurz during the events of Unremembered Empire and helped save Rebute Gilliman's mom, which definitely earns some brownie points. So, looking at everything, the positives, they destroyed the Thousand Suns, even if that's debatable in value, survived an Alpha Legion ambush, and managed to wound Horus. The negatives, they took catastrophic losses multiple times throughout the Heresy, made extremely questionable decisions, failed to reach Terra, and left Terra when they were needed the most, and were nearly wiped out as a legion. Even though they had some impact on the early goings of the war, and did manage to wound Horus, they also fumbled a lot. So I'm giving the Space Wolves a C grade, a perfectly average spot for a perfectly average legion. Space Wolf fans, you can be mad, but deep down, you know they sold. If you're still mad at me, well, just like go outside and bark at the moon or something, I don't know. Oh boy, here come the kings of the heresy. Roll out the golden carpet, folks. The Imperial Fists. Yes, I may have a little bit of a biased take with these fellas, but spoiler, they were truly one of the best legions throughout the heresy. But before I glaze them too hard, let's talk about their legion numbers and the size of their fleet. The Imperial Fists had a decently sized legion, though like most legions, their exact numbers tend to fluctuate. The best way to gauge their strength is around the time of the Siege of Terra, where they are estimated to be around 100 to 150,000 legionaries, and on top of that, they possessed what is widely considered one of the largest fleets among the legions, with around 1,500 warships of various classes and patterns, including the mighty Phalanx. Simply put, they had the numbers, they had the firepower, and they had one of the most defensively minded Primarchs in the entire setting. Rogel Dorn, my autistic gang. Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists were also among the first loyalists to learn of Horus's betrayal. And from that moment forwards, Dorn essentially became the central figure in organizing the Imperium's response to the heresy. While portions of his legion attempted to regroup through the warp storms, Dorn returned to Terra with his veteran companies and immediately began fortifying the Imperial Palace and preparing for the inevitable siege. Throughout the heresy, the Imperial Fists were involved in multiple massive engagements across the galaxy. They fought at the Battle of Fall against the Iron Warriors in a brutal fleet engagement, where despite being outnumbered, they held their ground and nearly destroyed the traitor fleet being commanded by Perturabo before being ordered to withdraw. If only my boy Alexius Bolax had stayed, Birdie would be a waste of space in space.
Huh?
Pretty solid start to the 7th Legion. They were also engaged in a prolonged conflict on Chthoniya, where they fought alongside other loyalist forces against overwhelming traitor forces, inflicting massive casualties even as the planet itself was ultimately rendered uninhabitable. At the same time, they were also dealing with the schism of Mars. Although they were forced to abandon the Red Planet, they still managed to evacuate thousands of suits of power armor and vast quantities of weapons, denying those resources to the enemy. Upon withdrawing, they besieged Mars for the remainder of the war up until the Siege of Terra. And of course, who could forget defeating the Alpha Legion and their sleeper cells at the Battle of Pluto, where Dorn Count Dooku'd Alpharius at the climax of the battle.
Do it.
Then comes the Siege of Terra, the most important reason for why the Imperial Fists are the GOATs. The 7th Legion was the backbone of the entire defense of the throne world. They oversaw the fortification of the Imperial Palace, organized the Solar War, and stood at the center of the Loyalist defense during the Siege of Terra. Alongside the White Scars and the Blood Angels, they fought against an absurd traitor force, including anywhere from 500 to 700,000 traitor marines, backed up by millions to billions of traitor guardsmen and warp entities. And they still held for 5 to 6 months, until time itself began breaking down. Sure, the Blood Angels and the White Scars were key to the defense of the city, but the Imperial Fists were the core of the entire defense. Without figures like Fafnir Ran, Sigismund, or Rogel Dorn, the Imperial Palace would not have lasted as long as it did. Even Sanguinius acknowledges this in The End and the Death. "You've performed the most extraordinary feat," Sanguinius says unexpectedly. "Please remember that." Dorn is taken aback by the frankness of the comment, and the innocent sincerity with which it is expressed. And that really says everything. Without the Imperial Fists holding Terra for as long as they did, the outcome of the heresy, which is still quite grim, would look very different. Horus may have won, Terra could have been destroyed, and hell, maybe even the Dark King could have ascended. But nope, none of that happened because the Imperial Fists were there. That alone is one of the single biggest contributions any legion made during the entire war. So even with all that glazing, it's definitely deserved. The Imperial Fists are an easy S-grade legion. True kings of the heresy. My autistic Primarch gets a great score. Man, the Night Lords really are something. To put it politely, they kinda just dicked around for the entire Horus Heresy. Slaughtered and flayed a bunch of civilians, got nearly annihilated by the Dark Angels. But hey, they can at least say they were the first to set foot upon the Imperial Palace walls during the siege. So, at least they have that. Before the heresy, the Night Lords had around 120,000 legionaries and over 800 ships, made up of roughly 200 capital ships and 600 escorts, which is actually pretty massive for a legion that's often considered smaller. So they had the numbers and the fleet to be a serious threat. But did that actually happen? Of course, they are present at Istvan V, where they helped devastate the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard alongside the other traitor legions, which gets them some participation points. After that, they returned to the Galactic East and launched what can best be described as an unfocused genocidal campaign.
Are we the baddies?
I'm not kidding, guys. The Night Lords literally just went planet by planet and massacred people. Most likely, this was meant to disrupt Loyalist support and prevent reinforcements from reaching Terra. But it wasn't the most organized or efficient contribution to the war effort. As we discussed prior with the Dark Angels section of this video, this was the Thramas Crusade, and to their credit, the Night Lords did manage to hold off the Dark Angels for about 3 years, which is actually pretty significant. That delay prevented the Dark Angels from participating in the Dropsite Massacre in the early stages of the Horus Heresy, which is legitimately an impactful contribution. But eventually, yeah, they got cooked. At the climax of the Thramas Crusade, the Night Lord's fleet was ambushed and absolutely mauled by the Dark Angels. By the end of the campaign, around 60,000 Night Lords were dead, Kurz was separated from his legion for the remainder of the war, and the 8th Legion itself was permanently shattered into multiple smaller warbands. The Night Lords, even after being broken apart, didn't just disappear though. The scattered warbands continue to wreak havoc across the Ultramar segmentum during the Imperium Secundus arc, which is the Battle of Sotha, where they destroyed the Pharaoh's device, the one thing piercing the Ruined Storm and allowing navigation across the Imperium. The Night Lords were also present at the Siege of Terra, but in very small numbers. And technically, they were the first to set foot on the walls, but their overall contribution was pretty insignificant compared to the other legions like the Iron Warriors. Jendar Scrivok, the commander of the Night Lords on Terra, was even thrown off the wall like a small child by Rolderon, which is an aura-losing moment if I've ever seen one. Although his legion kinda flopped, Conrad Kurz did not, especially during Imperium Secundus, where he was an absolute menace to the Loyalists and nearly killed multiple Primarchs. But even with his schizophrenic nightmare routine, the Legion as a whole just wasn't there for the biggest moments of the heresy in any meaningful way. So taking into account literally everything, their early success at Istvan, the Thramas delay, their catastrophic losses, the shattering of their Legion, and the lack of a major coordinated effort, I'm gonna give the Night Lords a D grade. Sorry Kurz, you might be my Pookie and a top 5 Primarch, but your Legion just kinda sucks. Oh yeah, another Loyalist Legion, the Blood Angels, led by the beloved Sanguinius, who would ultimately give his life at the end of the Siege of Terra. But before we get to that, let's talk about the basics, like their numbers and their fleet size, to see if they truly could have made an impact on the heresy. At the end of the Great Crusade and the beginning of the Horus Heresy, the Blood Angels numbered around 120,000 legionaries. They also possessed a massive fleet, consisting of roughly 300 capital ships and 600 sub-capital ships, about 900 vessels in total. So what did they do during the heresy? Well, they began the heresy at Cygnus Prime and immediately got thrown into hell. At Cygnus Prime, the Blood Angels were ambushed by a massive host of Chaos Demons alongside supporting Wordbearer forces. And keep in mind guys, the Blood Angels had no real understanding of chaos at this point, so imagine believing in the Imperial truth, where gods don't exist and then suddenly you're facing literal demons from the warp. I know I would piss my pants, don't lie to me guys, you would too. It was all a trap orchestrated by Horus and Erebus, designed to exploit the Blood Angel's gene seed flaw, the Red Thirst, and force Sanguinius and his legion to fall to Khorne. And it almost worked too. After around 10,000 Blood Angels slain and many more wounded, Sanguinius and his legion finally emerged victorious, destroying the demon host, along with Kabanda and Chris, who Sanguinius killed himself in single combat, who were, mind you, 2 incredibly powerful greater demons. After this, the Blood Angels played a role in the Imperium Secundus arc, before making their way towards Terra. And during the Siege of Terra, they went absolutely crazy. The Blood Angels launched constant sallies and held critical sections of the wall, like the Gorgon Bar, for extended periods of time, even against huge traitor assaults. Sanguinius himself banished Kabanda and Demon Primarch Angron within minutes of each other, which might be the coolest thing I've seen in my cow life. Later, when Horus dropped the shields on his ship, the Vengeful Spirit, Sanguinius accompanied the Emperor, Chadol Dorn, and Constantine Valdor to finally take out the War Master. Of course, in typical 40k fashion, Sanguinius, Chadol Dorn, Valdor, and the Emperor were all separated upon teleportation. But I kid you not, Sanguinius and his 300 Blood Angels balled the fuck out, as they were able to carve their way through the Vengeful Spirit, killing thousands of Sons of Horus legionaries who were waiting for them. Don't even get me started on Sanguinius vs. Horus, his death, and the Black Rage kicking in, resulting in the Blood Angels tearing through both Loyalist and traitor forces alike. All in all, the Blood Angels fought at Cygnus Prime, pushed towards Terra, fought at Better Garmon, and were pivotal during the Siege of Terra, where they helped the Imperial Fist and the White Scars hold the Imperial Palace for 5 to 6 months, even giving the ultimate sacrifice of their Primarch to help the Emperor achieve victory. Now, I will say their casualties were horrific. Out of 120,000 legionaries, only about 6,000 to 10,000 remained by the end of the war. So, what do we give them in terms of a grade? And I think this debate comes down to 2 options, S grade or A grade. If we compare them to legions like the Iron Warriors or the Imperial Fists, who have already received a S grade, legions who are active across the majority of the war, and truly help their side on the path to victory. So the question becomes, do the Blood Angels match that level of contribution? And honestly, I think they do. Specifically because of what they did during the siege. The impact of Sanguinius and the performances of captains like Raldoron, Nasir Amit, Zephon, and Belseptus, they were the backbone of the Loyalist effort when it mattered the most. So yeah, I'm gonna give the Blood Angels a S grade. They are borderline A, but I think they earned an S. Rest in peace, my sweet Sanguinius. This one's for you, pal. The Iron Hands, the Iron Hands, the Iron Hands. Yep, our first Shattered Legion. Unlike the other 2 legions who fought in the Dropside Massacre, the Raven Guard and the Salamanders, the Iron Hands were lucky and only a portion of their legion and, unfortunately, their Primarch were annihilated on Istvan. But before we really get to those nitty-gritty details, let's first talk about their numbers and their fleet size. At the start of the Heresy, they had about 113,000 legionaries and a decently sized fleet. So what did Ferrus manage do when he heard that Horus had committed the heresy? Well, he took his fastest ships and about 1/3 of his legion, which comes out to about 30,000 marines, and immediately traveled to Istvan. We all know what happened next. Ferrus charged in blindly, got betrayed by the other 5 traitor legions, and then lost his head. Not a great start for the 10th Legion. The rest of his fleet would follow him and would be ambushed in orbit as they entered the system. So at the end of the Dropside Massacre, the Iron Hands Legion had around 40,000 legionaries left. So although they had taken massive casualties, they were still a fairly intact legion. After the catastrophe at Istvan, the Iron Hands in essence dissolved briefly into the Shattered Legions. While other legions were a part of it, like the Raven Guard or the Salamanders, none were as active within it as the Iron Hands, led by many prominent Iron Hand leaders like Shadrach Medusan, and oh boy oh my, did they ruin the War Master's day. The Shattered Legions took part in the Shadow Wars, fighting the traitors across the Imperium, which really made a substantial difference. I will say though, that although they were a nuisance on the traitor supply lines, most of them didn't make the Siege of Terra. They did have members on the Sisyphine, which saved the DNA of all the Primarchs on Luna at the conclusion of the Solar War, and Autek Mor did throw a moon at the World Eater's recruitment world of Bolt, which even you guys have to admit is seriously badass. When it comes to grading them, I think there are once again 2 choices. We can either give them a B grade or a C grade. Let me think. They did decimate the Emperor's children on Istvan, as the 3rd Legion only had around 60,000 legionaries at the conclusion of the Dropside campaign, so with that in mind, I think I'm going to give them a B grade. Shadrach Medusan really did ball out, and although they didn't make the siege, their impact on the war was far better than, say, the Space Wolves or the Night Lords. So I think B grade is the golden spot for them. You're welcome, you 7 Iron Hand fans out there. The flesh is weak, am I right? Before moving on, this is not factoring in Ferrus Manus' dumbass decision to attack Istvan instead of, either waiting for his legion, heeding Alfarius and Omegon's advice, bombing the planet from orbit, or besieging it, or I don't know, doing anything other than what he did. You deserved to lose your head, buddy. You headless wonder, you. Oh boy, another kind of tough one, mainly because they completely devolved into a band of frothing, mindless berserkers.
That's a bummer.
But oh my god, I sure do love that blue and white armor. The World Eaters started the war with around 150,000 legionaries, and their fleet, led by the Gloriana-class flagship, the Conqueror, had around 60 capital ships and was described as well-equipped and supported, meaning they likely had a sizable number of sub-capital ships backing them up. Now, since we're talking about the World Eaters, we need to talk about the Butcher's Nails first. The Butcher's Nails were a cybernetic implant in the brain, which rewired every single legionary within the 12th to experience pleasure when killing, and pain when they were, not killing. This turned the 12th Legion of the Warhounds from an organized and dedicated legion into what they would eventually become, the Servants of Khorne. So keep that in mind as we continue into what they did throughout the Heresy. Led by Angron, the World Eaters purged their ranks at Istvan 3, and then helped the other traitor legions at Istvan 5. From there, they moved on to their next major campaign, the Shadow Crusade against the Ultramarines, with around 100,000 Marines remaining, which means they lost around 50,000 during the events of Istvan. Alongside the Wordbearers, the World Eaters inflicted heinous losses across Ultramar. This is highlighted in the book Betrayer. The year's journey from Istvan was more eventful than I anticipated. Angron and his legion delayed us, pausing to murder world after world on their wrathful whims. Our brother's mutilated psyche makes planning anything something of a chore, but at last, here we are, the beginning of the end. Ulixis, Espandor, Latona, elsewhere, they're killing their way across Ultramar. Now Gilliman's sons are crippled at Calf. The 500 worlds have suddenly found themselves rather starved of protection. A shame, I'm sure you'll agree. So the World Eaters were able to break hundreds of worlds, and all of this resulted in 3 major outcomes, which could cause them to receive a pretty high score. The traitors were able to escape largely intact. Angron ascended into a demon Primarch on Nuceria, which isn't exactly the World Eaters' fault, more Lorgar's, but it still gave them a massive powerful asset. And thirdly, the Ruin Storm was created. This storm physically and psychologically isolated Ultramar from the rest of the Imperium, preventing messages and the Loyalist legions like the Ultramarines, Blood Angels, and Dark Angels from reaching Terra. But after this though, things really started to fall off the wheels a little bit, as everyone got a little too obsessed with some blood for the Blood God. Following Angron's transformation, the World Eaters basically went on a galaxy-wide rampage, slaughtering world after world with no real strategic direction. They ignored Horus's summons to regroup at Ulanor, forcing Perturabo and the Iron Warriors to literally track them down and drag them back to the war effort, like the dogs they are. And even then, not all of them came back. Several warbands stayed behind in Ultramar, forming butcher fleets and continuing their own personal massacres, targeting densely populated worlds instead of anything strategically important. But I will say, still a majority of them showed up for the siege. And there, the World Eaters were instrumental in the assault on the Imperial Palace. They were the first to breach its walls, with Angron leading the charge, and Karn was the first through the breach. They were also at the forefront of the assault on the Eternity Gate during the final stages of the siege. Led by Angron, they nearly reached the gate before Angron was ultimately banished by the efforts of Sanguinius. And still, the World Eaters fought on until Horus was defeated. So even though they fought in several major engagements throughout the Heresy, but I am going to subtract some points because of the Butcher's Nails and later Khorne corruption, due to the effects it had on the World Eaters' cohesion, organization, and fighting skill. Now don't get me wrong, the World Eaters are some of the most formidable fighters in the entire Imperium, and now in the current setting, they are even more feared. What I am saying though is that due to the effects of the Butcher's Nails and Khorne corruption, the World Eaters were not truly a threat in a tactical sense, as their ability to reason and form logic was almost entirely gone, meaning they were only a weapon used to swarm and overrun enemy positions. A perfect example of this is when the Iron Warriors under Perturabo almost destroyed Angron and the World Eaters because they were too busy running around slaughtering random worlds, similar to the Emperor's Children getting lost in their own sauce. Still, the World Eaters had a real impact on the war, so I'm going to give them a B grade. Yep, over the Space Wolves. They had major victories during the Shadow Crusade, played a key role in creating the Ruined Storm, and even though they got sidetracked afterwards, they still returned for Better Garmon, the Sol System, and finally Terra, where they were constantly at the front of the fighting. So I think my decision to give them a B grade is pretty solid. Finally, we come to the Ultra Smurfs, led by Guilliman. The Ultramarines specialize in adaptability, strategic discipline, and balanced warfare. Meaning, kinda like the Dark Angels, they're a jack of all trades. They were said to have one of the largest Space Marine legions with around 250,000 Marines, and their fleet had 30 to 35 capital ships, which shows how immense their prowess was. The Ultramarines are unique compared to the other legions like say the Imperial Fists or those present at the Dropsite Massacre, as they had no idea what the hell was going on until the war was literally at their doorstep. Before Horus declared his treachery, he ordered the Ultramarines to assemble for a war under the pretense of an orc invasion. So Guilliman, being the Boy Scout that he is, gathered 180,000 Marines at Calth and awaited the word bearers, who arrived with 50,000 troops to support this quote-unquote orc campaign. But then, to almost no one's surprise, except I guess Guilliman's, the word bearers immediately betrayed him. The Ultramarines were brutally decimated, with 4/5 of their fleet being destroyed and nearly 120,000 Marines killed, and another 28,000 being rendered combat incapable. This amounts to roughly 60% of their pre-heresy strength, guys. 60%. Despite these catastrophic losses, the Battle of Calth was still a victory for the Ultramarines. Even though the surface of the planet was utterly destroyed and the Underwar would begin shortly afterwards, the Ultramarines annihilated the 50,000 word bearers and destroyed half of their fleet. And let me tell you folks, it gets worse for the Ultramarines and Ultramar because, as you remember from the section we just discussed, the Shadow Crusade began immediately afterwards, as the World Eaters and the Word Bearers ravaged hundreds of worlds across the Ultramar segmentum, which culminated in the Battle of Nuceria, where using Angron's Rage, Lorgar completed a ritual that transformed Angron into a demon Primarch, empowering him with the might of Khorne. Lorgar also created the Ruined Storm, separating Ultramar from the rest of the Imperium. One major positive worth noting is that during the Shadow Crusade, a small team of Ultramarines, Thousand Suns, and World Eater loyalists destroyed the Furious Abyss, an Abyss-class battleship intended to destroy the planet of Macragge. These ships were among the largest and most powerful in the Imperium, rivaled only by the Phalanx. But apparently Lorgar had 2 more of these ships just kinda lying around, so it kinda lessens the overall impact of this sabotage mission, which kinda makes you question why Battle for the Abyss even existed in the first place. But still, saving the planet of Macragge from destruction is a huge turn of events, because imagine what would happen if Ultramar lost its capital. The whole segmentum might have collapsed into chaos. Following the Shadow Crusade, the Ultramarines regrouped and formally established Imperium Secundus alongside the Dark Angels and the Blood Angels. This was due to the fact that Guilliman thought Terra had already fallen. He appointed Sanguinius as Emperor and the Lion as Protector, while the Triumvirate tried to figure out what was their next move. Though it was ultimately dissolved, it brought time and maintained order in the completely fractured Imperium. The Ultramarines went on to achieve victory at Sofa against the Night Lords and then pushed towards Davin to break the Ruined Storm, where the 3 Primarchs and their legions fought through a massive demonic host to destroy the Ruined Storm and reopen a path to Terra. Afterwards, Sanguinius raced towards the Throne World, while Guilliman and Lionel Johnson led diversionary attacks against Horus and the Iron Warriors' blockades. So, even with the Ultra Smurfs losing 60% of their legion in their first battle of the Heresy, including a vast portion of their fleet, and several hundred planets in the following Shadow Crusade, they were still able to reorganize extremely fast and strike back against the traitors. Wow, you gotta give it to those Ultra Smurfs. They do know how to do their paperwork. After breaking the Ruin Storm, Guilliman gathered every available force and advanced towards Terra. In his path stood a massive defensive network of worlds held by the Iron Warriors. Through a series of brutal battles, both sides took heavy losses, but the Ultramarines pushed forwards. As Guilliman advanced, the Ultramarines gathered every single loyalist force they could possibly communicate with. This is described in The Lost and the Damned. "He will do so," said Sanguinius Shirley. "Horus brought most of his army here. Rebute's forces are formidable. When I left him, he was busy sending orders that Ultramar and all the Ultima Segmentum be emptied of men. More forces flocked to him on the way, including elements of Vulcan's and Corax's legions we thought lost. When he arrives, it will be at the head of a force near the match of Horus's. And from the End in the Death, Part 3, the fleet had deployed to wide assault positions 18 light minutes outside the Terminator shock boundary of the Solar Realm. Said Lamiad, the fleet amasses 3,200 vessels. Thiel knows it by heart. 3,200 principal vessels, most of them Grand Cruiser class or larger, supported by bulk carriers, war engine, mass transports, and a flotilla of tenders. It contains most of Battlefleet Macragge, the Connor Squadron, the Saramanth Squadron, the Lux Ultramaris Battle Group, the 3rd Vanguard Flotilla of the 500 Worlds, the Oklutta 2nd Principal Fleet, the Minos Crucius Fast Attack, and the allied warships of the Shattered Legions. So Guilliman and the Ultramarines literally assembled one of the largest loyalist forces of the entire war, fighting through Iron Warrior defenses and gathering reinforcements along the way. While they did not arrive in time to save the Emperor, they effectively secured the Sol System afterwards and crushed the remaining traitors present. So what's their grade? The Ultramarines are one of the greatest loyalist legions, but they suffered massive early losses at Calth and during the Shadow Crusade. Though I will say they were caught off guard during these attacks, which softens the blow. They recovered quickly, stabilized Ultramar, acted as the main diversion force for the Blood Angels, and took the brunt of the fighting on the road to Terra, still maintaining over 100,000 Marines by the end of the war. I think that all solidly means they deserve a A grade, just barely missing an S grade by the shortest of margins, on Guilliman's perfectly calculated head. Does anyone smell that? It smells like shit. Oh wait, it's just the Death Guard. The Death Guard, led by Mortarion, are specialists in relentless attrition warfare. And before the Heresy, they had a smaller legion, only 95,000 Marines, and although their fleet size is not exactly known, even though they had a Gloriana and the Terminus Est, their fleet was probably not large either. And due to the events of Istaban 3 and Istaban 5, they lost immediately a third of their legion, meaning roughly 31,000 of their own were killed. Once again, it's kind of crazy how many traitors were butchered in the opening parts of the war, especially on Istaban 3. Like, all of these traitors were fighting with decimated legions. After the events of the Istaban system, Mortarion would end up splitting his fleet, commanding one portion while another would go to Typhus, who absolutely sucks. Everyone fling poo at that guy. I hate him. Mortarion's smaller fleet attempted to sway Jekatai Khan and the White Scars on Prospero, which failed, but they did make up for it as they fought alongside Horus at the battles of Dwell and Moloch, before rejoining Typhus's main fleet, which had been conducting its own campaign against the Dark Angels, which also failed, because Typhus was trying to acquire the Tuchulia machine, which ultimately fell into the hands of the Dark Angels.
You had one job. Just the one?
Later during the war, Horus tasked Mortarion with hunting down and destroying the White Scars, who, as we discussed earlier, were pillaging and rampaging through the traitor supply lines. Determined to settle the score, the Death Guard, alongside the Emperor's children under Idawan, cornered the Scars at the Dark Glass during the Battle of Catalyst, but completely failed to finish the job as the White Scars escaped at Terra. So right off the bat, it appears the Death Guard had several pretty big failures. They lost a massive chunk of their legion at Istaban 3, which, while intentional, still hurts. They lost even more at Istaban 5. They failed to stop the White Scars from escaping to Terra, which is a huge strategic loss, and Typhus was defeated by Lionel Johnson, who secured the Tuchula machine in the process. So they did pick up wins at Dwell and Moloch, but those aren't exactly decisive, Legion-defining victories unless you count Moloch, as the moment Horus began leveling up like a Pokemon, going from post-Davin to post-Moloch. But that's more of a Horus side quest than points given to the stinky boys of the 14th. Then we get to their fall to chaos, which is such a peak Typhus is such a dick moment. While en route to Terra, Typhus killed all of the navigators in the 14th fleet, stranding the entire Legion in the warp and forcing them into Nurgle's embrace. Which is how the Death Guard became disgusting, unstoppable Plague Marines we all know and love. A great upgrade in durability, but a terrible look in terms of control and cohesion. Mortarion and the Death Guard did fight on the front lines during the Siege of Terra and spread countless diseases among the defenders, but they still failed in taking key objectives. They couldn't take the Astronomicon from the Dark Angels, and they lost the Lionsgate Spaceport to the White Scars and Jekatai Khan, both massive failures, during the most important battle of the entire war. Hell, Mortarion was even banished from the battlefield entirely. So, what grade do we give the Death Guard? They lost several significant battles, but they were still instrumental in the long grind towards Terra. Similar to the World Eaters, they were important for the long haul and largely stayed committed to the war effort until things went full chaos and disgusting. But those major losses in key moments, especially ones that directly benefited the Loyalists, hold them back. I think all in all, this results in a solid B grade. They were there constantly throughout the war, they just failed at the biggest moments. Just imagine them like Michael Jordan if he didn't win all of those title games. Yeah, he probably wouldn't be called the GOAT either. Oh shit, what is, I got dust in my eye, I can't see. Oh, it all makes sense. Yep, it's time to talk about the Thousand Suns. A very controversial legion just like the Space Wolves, but the reverse situation because I tend to glaze them too much in my videos. But hey, you can't blame me, look at those drippin' unis. The 15th Legion is commanded by Magnus the Red, and they were a completely psychic legion, as most of them possessed some form of psychic powers. And to be honest, they are one of the weirder traitor legions to grade since they lost 90% of their legion right off the bat. Even though their name is 1,000 Suns, their pre-heresy numbers were actually around 80 to 90,000, which alongside a fleet of 40 capital ships and 120 smaller ships, they had quite the force to be reckoned with. Especially when you take into account that most of their Space Marines were fucking psychers. But still, they lost 90% of their legion during the burning of Prospero, leaving them with roughly 8 to 9,000 Marines. So, and even worse, Magnus himself was shattered into a million pieces. So they lost the entirety of their legion and their Primarch. Not off to a great start now, are we? And I will be honest here, folks, after the burning of Prospero, the Thousand Suns didn't really do much after. The Legion was completely fractured, with many breaking off into independent warbands rather than functioning as a unified force. Others even remained loyalists as Black Shields. But the main Thousand Suns faction focused heavily on finding and restoring Magnus the Red, specifically Ahriman and his Cabal, who spent a huge portion of the Heresy tracking each of these shards down, eventually recovering most of them, only to learn that the final and most important piece was still on Terra. So in order to recover this piece, they joined Horus for the siege. Magnus took what remained of his legion, which was a very small contingent compared to the other legions, and joined the Horus Heresy.
He said it!
For most of the siege, they were not frontline fighters, instead focusing on summoning demonic reinforcements and casting supporting psychic rituals. When the outer walls of the Imperial Palace fell, they were tasked with breaking the inner wards. Infiltrating the palace with an elite group, Magnus was confronted by Malcador the Sigillite, who revealed to him that his final shard was beyond his reach. Upon learning of this, Magnus would pivot to assassinating the Emperor on the Golden Throne, which would also fail thanks to Vulcan and his forces, resulting in Magnus fully giving himself over to chaos and becoming a demon Primarch. After that, Magnus attempted to weaken the Emperor further by attacking his psychic defenses through the webway. But once again, he was stopped by Vulcan, who beat the ever-living shit out of him with a hammer. With Magnus beaten, the 1,000 Suns basically stopped caring entirely. And upon Horus's death, they retreated with the other traitor forces into the Eye of Terror. So how do we grade the Sandman? The 1,000 Suns did manage to restore Magnus, but that didn't really have a huge impact on the outcome of the heresy. They made it to Terra, summoned demons, and did infiltrate the palace, but failed to assassinate the Emperor. So, not exactly 2 for 2. They're batting 0 right now. Magnus ascended a demonhood and did weaken the Emperor's wards in the webway, but was defeated and banished by Vulcan. So we're 0 for 3 in the Siege of Terra. And pretty much after that, the Legion basically stopped caring, as we see airmen literally looking for knowledge and books during the events of the End and the Death. They just didn't really do much, guys. Yes, they crippled themselves and took heavy losses against the Space Wolves, Custodes, and Sisters of Silence during the burning of Prospero, dealing damage in return, but still, they were shattered in one battle. After Prospero, they basically disappeared as a major force. All in all, it's kinda crazy the 1,000 Suns just didn't do anything when their entire legion was made up of Psychers, who had the potential to be one of the most powerful legions in the entire heresy. And even with only 9,000 left, they should have been insanely impactful. Instead, they got one major battle, got wrecked, and then spent the rest of the heresy scattered, distracted, or trying to save the Purple Nurple Magnus. Which, once again, is insane considering Magnus is supposed to be one of the strongest Primarchs, as the second most powerful Psyker in the galaxy compared to the Emperor. So although I love my Sandmen, I'm going to give them our first and only fraud grade so far on this list. I mean, simply, they didn't do anything, and so I think the fraud grade is perfect for the 15th Legion. I'm still going to glaze the hell out of Magnus the Red, but here I have to give them a bad grade.
You're not an intellectual. You're a fake and a fraud.
Oh boy, here come the Sons of Lubercal, the Green Boys. The Sons of Horus are a very interesting legion to grade here. They specialized in brutal shock assaults, close-range firepower, and elite hard-hitting units. But as the Arch-Traitors Legion, where do they come in? Well, let's first talk about their pre-heresy numbers and their fleet size, just like normal. Come on guys, we don't want to be getting ahead of ourselves here. The Sons of Horus pre-heresy numbers are around 130 to 170,000 legionaries, and their fleet consisted of around 100 capital ships and 300 smaller vessels, totaling roughly 400 ships, led of course by the Gloriana-class Vengeful Spirit. Additionally, as the War Masters Legion, they received the newest power armor, weapons, and Terminator suits, making them extremely well equipped before the heresy. All of this sets them up to be a heavy impactor on the entirety of the war. I mean, it is called the Horus Heresy, and if the Sons of Horus weren't impactful, I'd probably crash out from confusion. Like many of the traitor legions, they lost about a third of their strength at Istvan III, meaning somewhere between 30,000 to 50,000 Marines were purged, which is quite the L. After that, the Sons of Horus went on to help shatter the Loyalist legions at Istvan V, destroying the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard. From that point onwards, they served as the primary spearhead of the rebellion, consistently employing brutal, lightning-fast shock assaults to break Imperial lines, and were present at nearly every major engagement across the war. They secured major victories at Moloch, Trisolin, Better-Garmon, and of course, played a central role in the Siege of Terra. Even though they ultimately lost the war, they shattered the Space Wolves Legion and were always at the forefront of the conflict. They were always just kinda there, fighting in the spearhead off-screen. That's kinda the defining trait of the Sons of Horus, and the reason I think they don't quite reach an S grade. Despite their constant presence and importance, they didn't go above and beyond in the same way as legions like the Iron Warriors, who held back the Ultramarines, or the Imperial Fists, who held the Sol system far longer than anyone expected. The Sons of Horus led, they spearheaded, and they dominated key battles, but they didn't carry like the other legions. They were always just there. And because of that, they fall just short of an S grade, giving them a solid A grade for the Horus Heresy. Sorry Horus, your bad genetics probably passed on to your sons, resulting in this high but not S grade take. The Preachers of Lorgar are next, and they are the first to truly turn to chaos. After their fall, the 17th Legion specialized in unholy, chaotic warfare, focused on summoning demons, possession, and fanatical support from massive waves of cultists. Now, as you all may know, I've talked extensively on how much of a bum Lorgar is in combat, but as Legion, not so much. Let's first talk about their Legion numbers and the size of their fleet. At the beginning of the Heresy, they had between 100,000 to 150,000 legionaries, and their fleet was believed to have possibly exceeded the Imperial Fists in size, meaning they had potentially over 1,500 ships, which possibly included 8 Gloriana-class ships and 3 Abyss-class ships, which, as we discussed earlier, were among the most powerful vessels in the Imperium. But this wasn't even the most impressive part of the Wordbearers, since they are the true architects of the Heresy, as the Wordbearers fell to chaos 40 years before the Heresy even began. So you're probably asking yourself, what the hell did these fanatical bald guys do during that time? Well, led by Erebus, Corfarion, and of course Lorgar, the Wordbearers planted the seeds of the Heresy, creating the warrior lodges that spread chaos and Space Marine Brotherhood over loyalty to the Emperor. They also cleansed their ranks of loyalists during this period, ensuring their entire legion was fully devoted to chaos, unlike other traitor legions. They even managed to avoid detection by the Adeptus Custodes, despite having custodian observers embedded within them. The Wordbearers kept the custodians at arm's length, using sorcerous rituals to block astropathic communication with Terra, ensuring that all of their actions went completely without notice. They were also directly responsible for Horus being mortally wounded and ultimately falling to chaos, which essentially means that without the Wordbearers, there is no Horus Heresy, no Chaos Uprising on that scale, and no grimdark future we all know and love. So guys, you gotta give it up to Erebus. Without this cunt, the setting we all know and love wouldn't exist. Outside of being the architects of the Heresy, they fought at Istvan V, destroyed Calf, and crippled a massive portion of the Ultramarines, killing around 120,000 Marines and 4/5 of the Ultramarines fleet, while only losing 50,000 of their own, which adds to their already stacked report card. Then they rampaged across Ultramar, destroying hundreds of worlds and ultimately creating the Ruin Storm during the Shadow Crusade. Their involvement does kind of fall off somewhat after the Shadow Crusade, but the Wordbearers still mustered at Ulanor for the drive on Terra. But by this point, Lorgar had begun to see Horus as weak and secretly plotted his own coup, attempting to use Fulgrim as a weapon after binding him with his true name, as seen in the events of Slaves to Darkness. However, of course, that plan failed as Lorgar didn't realize the Heresy was called Horus, and so got his shit rocked and was exiled. This resulted in only 5,000 Wordbearers fighting in the Siege of Terra, under Zardu Lyak. But even without a large number of legionaries, Zardu Lyak still made the most of it by sacrificing himself to open a full warp rift on Terra, causing the first demons to fully manifest during the siege. So what grade do I give these fellas? Well, taking a step back, without the Wordbearers, there is no Heresy, no Horus's Fall, no Shattered Calf, no Devastated Ultramar, and no Ruin Storm. Sure, you can dock them for their failed coup against Horus, but that doesn't outweigh everything else they accomplished. Like, come on guys, I know we all bash Lorgar a ton. He's weak, the Wordbearers are losers, but this is an easy S grade. Honestly, they're not just S tier, they're one of the top contenders for MVP of the entire Heresy. Give it up for those bald men in red, guys. Give it up for them. The second of the Shattered Legions, the Salamanders. These are the sons of Vulcan, who are excellent at close-range warfare with a heavy focus on flame and melta weaponry. Now I know there are a ton of Salamander fans out there, so when I grade these guys, please be gentle on my cow heart. Let's start as always with their legion numbers and fleet size. Before the Heresy, they numbered around 89,000 legionaries, and while their fleet isn't well documented, they had at least one Gloriana-class ship, the Flamerot. However, they didn't possess a large or even particularly notable number of vessels, which along with their legion size really matters because at the very beginning of the Heresy, the Salamanders, like all of the other Shattered Legions, were annihilated at the Dropsite Massacre. Unlike the Iron Hands, the Salamanders were almost entirely present at Isstvan V, and as a result, roughly 90% of the Legion was wiped out, leaving only a few thousand survivors, like First Captain Artillus Numan, who managed to extract a scattered group of survivors. But an even bigger blow to the 18th Legion was the fact that they effectively lost their Primarch as well. Vulcan was captured and tortured by Conrad Kurz for some time, before eventually escaping to Merkrag, losing his sanity along the way, and then seemingly dying a final death to the Fulgrite, one of the weirdest weapons ever. I mean, it's literally a frozen piece of the Emperor's psychic power. Whoever created that should be in jail. Oh, look at that, it's Nick Kime. What a coincidence. Someone go arrest that man. Yeah, Vulcan fans, I'm so sorry for you. Nick Kime truly is not the greatest rider. The Salamander's arc during the Heresy got even weirder when Artillus Numan sacrificed himself in a bizarre way by chucking himself into a volcano to bring Vulcan back to life on Nocturne. This whole situation is incredibly vague because 1, why the hell did this even need to happen? And 2, why did he need to throw himself into a volcano? This isn't Lord of the Rings, guys. What? And when asked about this situation, Nick Kime literally said it's up to the reader's interpretation. Classic cop-out response. So what did the Salamanders actually do during the Heresy, besides getting used like a toilet at Chuck E. Cheese? Well, by the time of Imperium Secundus, there were only a couple thousand of them left. Vulcan, with the help of a few Salamanders, eventually arrived on Terra about 5 years into the Heresy, and spent the remainder of the war guarding the Imperial Palace, constructing the Talisman of Seven Hammers, and protecting the Golden Throne. That role alone was massive, and it culminated in him defeating Magnus the Red in the Webway, which is no small feat. So Vulcan himself definitely had a major impact on the Horus Heresy, no question. As for his Legion though, what remained of it was broken and scattered. Some joined the Black Shields or Grey Shields, which were roving bands of mixed legionary survivors conducting guerrilla warfare against Horus and his traitor forces, while others would join the Shattered Legions. But to put it simply, the Salamanders weren't really a unified legion anymore, and existed more as fragments, harassing traitor supply lines and getting up to some background level chaos. But compared to the other loyalist legions, it just wasn't that impactful. So I see 2 options for grading them. We can either give them an F grade for fraud or a D grade. I think in order for a legion to qualify as a fraud, they have to do basically next to nothing throughout the Heresy. For example, the Thousand Suns. And the Salamanders still did contribute. Through the Black Shields, the Shattered Legions, through getting Vulcan to Terra, and through Vulcan's massive role in the endgame. So I don't think the Salamanders deserve a fraud grade, but at the same time, as a legion, they simply did not have a major impact on the war, due to them being completely annihilated at the Dropsite Massacre. And to be fair, that's not really their fault, it's just unbelievably bad luck. Still, I can't reward a legion for getting obliterated, so I'm going to give them a D grade. I'm sorry, Salamander fans, looking at you, Musty and Crabzilla, please don't come to my house and milk me. I'll provide cookies and milk in the Discord. I hope that is enough to stave off the milking. Now we come to the Raven Guard, who are kind of in the same boat as the Salamanders. The Raven Guard are masters of stealth and ambushes, and they are led by the mysterious and very much emo Corvus Corax. The Raven Guard had around 80,000 legionaries before the Heresy, with the fleet structure geared towards speed and precision rather than massive, slow-moving gun lines of other legions. So right off the bat, they did not really have a large legion, which definitely is going to impact their role in the Heresy. Just like the Salamanders, they took catastrophic losses at Isstvan V, being reduced from roughly 80,000 Marines to a mere 3,000 or 5,000 survivors, which is about 94% of the Legion gone. However, Corvus Corax escaped, and I've got to say, Corax was kind of moving different during the Dropside Massacre. As we see Horus himself state, his brothers can swing the course of battle, of course. At that moment, Corax is doing just that in the Northern Zone. And it's further elaborated in Dropside Massacre that Corax slaughtered hundreds to maybe even thousands of Marines in the thick of the fighting. But that was not it. Corax also slaughtered almost all of the Galvor back, insanely powerful demon-possessed Marines on the level of Argol Tal, and would have killed Lorgar if Conrad Kurz hadn't intervened. But remember folks, we're grading the Legion as a whole, but Corax was kinda him at Istvan. I will admit to that point that Corax only escaped at the end because the Alpha Legion basically allowed it, with Alfarius having bigger plans for the Raven Guard. After fleeing, Corax made it back to Terra and eventually gained access to the Emperor's secret semen.
Huh?
The same stuff he used to create the Primarchs. Returning to his homeworld, he began to rebuild his Legion, and at first it worked perfectly. New Astartes that were faster, stronger, and smarter, with rapid success rates. But of course, the Alpha Legion and Omegon couldn't allow Corvus Corax to become a main character again, and said, not on my watch. Omegon and his operatives sabotaged the gene tech with demon-tainted corruption, turning the next wave of recruits into monstrous demons, while stealing the pure data from themselves. So just as the Raven Guard were able to make a comeback, they got hit in the kneecaps. Even with that handicap, Corax still took to the field. With around 4,000 Astartes, he assaulted the Perfect Fortress, an Emperor's Children's stronghold, and completely wiped the traitor force with minimal losses. The Raven Guard then went on to fight at the Battle of Urant, where they saved the remainder of the Space Wolves Legion from getting wiped out. Following that, Corax committed to fighting Horus through shadow warfare, striking from the dark instead of trying to rebuild his shattered Legion. So the Raven Guard didn't really have a major impact on the war. They were not in the thick of the fighting, and they were not on Terra. But even though they were a small legion, their decentralized structure, small cells, and independent strike forces kept them effective. Some of their most notable actions came from Raven Guard elements aboard the Sisyphum, especially Nykoa Sherokin, who managed to kill Lucius the Eternal, shoot Fulgrim in the face with a sniper rifle, and help secure the DNA of all the Primarchs. At the end of the day, they suffer from the same issue as the Salamanders and the Iron Hands. Most of their legion got obliterated early on. But unlike the Salamanders, they still had their Primarch actively leading them and maintained a somewhat large guerrilla operation. 4,000 Marines isn't a lot to work with, but they made it work. Their guerrilla warfare was genuinely impactful, they saved the Space Wolves, and contributed to the destruction of traitor worlds. So, adding that all together, I think giving them a C grade is perfect. They didn't have a massive war-defining impact like the top-tier legions, but their shadow war mattered, and they consistently punched above their weight. That's a respectable grade for these Emo Bird Boys. Finally, we come to the Alpha Legion, and oh boy, this is gonna be a wild ride. The Alpha Legion is officially labeled a traitor legion, but their actions are schizophrenic to say the least. Sometimes they fight for the traitors, sometimes for the loyalists, and sometimes they do both at once. For example, before the Dropside Massacre began, Alfarius and Omegon even tried to warn Ferrus Manus. Because of this duality, it's only fair to give them 2 grades. One for their actions on the traitor side, and one for their loyalist interventions. As always, let's start by reviewing their Marine totals and fleet strength to get a sense of what they were capable of. Exact numbers are tricky with the Alpha Legion though. Conflicting accounts put their Marine strength anywhere from 90,000 to 180,000. Their fleet size isn't clearly documented either, but during the Condex campaign in Book 8 of the Horus Heresy, we do get some insight, as they fielded 1,000 ships against the White Scars, though a third of those were fakes, cargo vessels disguised as warships, which the White Scars easily swept aside. This means they probably had roughly 666 actual warships, and if you factor in simultaneous operations against the Space Wolves, they could have maintained a fleet of about 1,000 vessels at peak capacity, which included 2 Gloriana-class ships, the Alpha and the Beta. So even though they kept their numbers hidden, with my cow research, it appears the Alpha Legion had quite the army and fleet to do a lot of damage. Now, let's get to their actions. On the traitor side, they participated in the Dropside Massacre, helped destroy 3 Loyalist legions, the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands. They also sabotaged the Raven Guard's reconstruction efforts, destroying their Gene Seed technology and preventing them from rebuilding their legion. In addition, they manipulated seemingly loyal Alpha Legion members into killing other Loyalist-aligned Alpha cells, nearly wiped out the Space Wolves at the Battle of the Alexius Nebula, leaving only 40,000 survivors, and they even attempted to assassinate Rabute Gilliman on Markrag in the book Unremembered Empire. But that is not it, folks. They also spearheaded the assault on Pluto during the Battle of Pluto, and maintained sleeper cells across the Sol system and on Terra, harassing Loyalist forces and attacking strategically. Though their Primarch Alfarius was killed during the Battle of Pluto, trying to explain to Chadol Dorn how to achieve true victory, and if we're gonna be really quite frank here, why the hell would Alfarius think that would work? To break it all down, Alfarius had just attacked Pluto suddenly, had launched multiple sleeper cell operations across the Sol system, killing probably millions, and was now in hand-to-hand combats with his brother, and still thought he could convince him of a diplomatic solution. Alfarius, I don't know if you're stupid or a moron, but come on dude, that's not gonna work. The Alpha Legion did not take part in the Siege of Terra, but instead scattered their legion to help fight the approaching Gilliman. I think all in all, the Alpha Legion's traitor actions throughout the war give them a solid A grade. They inflicted serious damage, held key positions, and ensured Loyalist forces were consistently harried and disrupted. On the Loyalist side, the Alpha Legion saved Corvus Corax at Istvan, ensuring an entire Primarch survived, which would be essential to the Raven Guard, having an impact on the Heresy at all. They delayed and guided the White Scars towards a Loyalist stance, subtly fed false intelligence to Horus about Dorn's defenses, and manipulated key events to ensure certain Loyalist victories. Their interventions prevented a total Loyalist collapse and indirectly influenced the broader war in the Emperor's favor. While impactful, their Loyalist actions were limited and tactical rather than strategic. For these efforts, I think a C grade is perfect for these schizophrenic Loyalist lizards. They made a difference, but not enough to radically shift the outcome of the heresy. Although you could argue that the Khan was going to pick the Emperor's side anyways, but they also saved Corvus Corax from getting murdered by Angron, which I think is pretty significant for the Loyalist side. So that's it, folks. We've gone through every single Space Marine Legion and given them a grade. Let's now recap. We gave 1 fraud grade to the Thousand Sons for their complete lack of effort and notable actions during the heresy. We gave out 3 D grades to the Emperor's Children, Night Lords, and Salamanders, due to them either getting completely wiped out in a single campaign, or them doing too many drugs. I gave out 3 Cs to the Space Wolves, the Loyalist Alpha Legion, and the Raven Guard, since they still had an impact on the heresy, but also not really. The Iron Hands, Death Guard, and World Eaters received Bs for being mainstays of the war. I gave out 4 A grades to the Dark Angels, Ultramarines, Sons of Horus, and the White Scars. And then finally, I gave out 4 S grades to the Blood Angels, Imperial Fists, Iron Warriors, and the Word Bearers, as each of these legions went above and beyond, and were clearly a deciding factor for their side. But now it's time to select the MVP of each side. For the traitors, the clear MVP of the Horus Heresy has to be the Word Bearers. These guys were the architects of the entire heresy. They orchestrated the spread of chaos, created the warrior lodges, cleansed their legion of any loyalist sympathizers without notice, and avoided detection by the custodians, allowing Horus's betrayal to reach a catastrophic scale. A close second would be the Iron Warriors, who put the later days of the heresy, specifically the siege, on their back, but the Word Bearers were the sole reason the heresy occurred, so it has to be them. For the Loyalists, the crown easily goes to the Imperial Fists. From holding back an obscene number of traitors during the Siege of Terra, and to orchestrating the defense of many key systems across the Imperium, the Imperial Fists were the rock of the Loyalist side. The true autistic gangs, so to say. But that is going to do it for this video. A huge shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members: Impossy Paul, Tyler Pick7, Musty, Keydry, Seth Capizilla, Lag, Cunning Karkle, Caleb White, Omar, Dinkleberry, and Ultrazon27. I appreciate each and every one of you guys, and it would mean a lot to me if more of you guys joined my Patreon or YouTube members. There is a bunch of fun perks that go with either of these. They just help support me and allow me to make even more juicy, beautiful content. I have a lot of fun videos planned for this month, including power scaling the 40k authors, the Misfits from Dark Tide, and many, many more. I'm also planning a Fulgrim week during 420, so stay tuned for that one. As always, my beloved herd, stay milked, and I'll see you all in the next video.